Zuwena and her husband Bako were driving through the quiet hills of Nyamira, Kenya. They were on their way to visit Bako's sick mother, a normal journey they had made many times before. The road was familiar, the air calm, but that day, something went terribly wrong. Their car's brakes suddenly failed on a steep bend. In a flash, the vehicle swerved off the road and rolled into a deep, hidden valley. People nearby heard the crash and came running. They found Bako lying beside the car, bruised and shocked, but alive. He was rushed to the hospital and quickly recovered, but Zuwena was nowhere to be seen. Search teams combed the area for days. They looked under rocks, in bushes, even downstream. Still, there was no sign of her body. Some said maybe wild animals had dragged her away. Others whispered darker things. In the end, the search was called off. Zuwena was officially declared dead. The village mourned. A small funeral was held with a closed casket. People cried, sang songs, and said goodbye. But no one talked about the strange truth, that the casket was empty. There was no body inside, just clothes and flowers. But life had to move on. What no one knew was that Zuwena had survived. She had been thrown far from the crash site and found hours later by a quiet farmer in the hills of Molo, hundreds of kilometers away. She was unconscious, badly hurt, and had no ID on her. The farmer, not knowing who she was, took her to a tiny village clinic. The place had no internet, no phones, and barely any medicine. For weeks she fought for her life, slipping in and out of coma, while Zuwena struggled in silence. Bako was seen back in Nyamira, smiling, laughing, even going on dates. Less than 2 months later, he announced his engagement to a woman named Naledi. He said he was finally healing from his loss. The wedding was grand. Decorations, food, dancing. It seemed like the whole town was there. Bako gave a touching speech about finding love again after pain. He even wore the same watch Zuwena had once given him. But just as the couple was about to say their vows, the church doors flew open. A gasp filled the room. There she was, Zuwena, alive, walking slowly down the aisle with a limp and a long white scarf. People screamed. Some fainted. The photographer dropped his camera. Bako's face turned white. He dropped the wedding ring and couldn't speak. Naledi shouted, "Who is this woman?" Zuwena held up her torn hospital bracelet and said, "Your bride called me dead, but I am very much alive." By that evening, photos and videos of the scene were everywhere. Social media exploded. Zombie Bride and Baikin Nyamira miracle started trending. Millions watched the video of Zuwena slapping Bako and handing him court papers in front of the priest. But instead of hiding, Zuwena stood tall. She went back to school, opened a center for women, and wrote a book called They Buried Me Too Soon. When asked how she survived, she smiled and said, "Some people survive accidents. I survived a husband." Nobody in Nyamira knew that Zuwena was still alive. After the crash, while everyone believed she had died, something strange and unbelievable had happened. A quiet farmer in the faraway Molo Hills had found her lying in the bushes, unconscious, broken, and barely breathing. She was covered in cuts, her clothes torn, and her body cold. The farmer didn't know who she was. She had no phone, no ID, and couldn't speak, but he didn't leave her there. He lifted her carefully, put her on his donkey cart, and took her to a small rural clinic in the nearby village. The clinic had no internet, no TV, no radio, just a few nurses, old beds, and limited medicine. It was a place forgotten by the world, and that's where Zuwena lay, between life and death, as the days passed. For weeks, she didn't wake up. Her head injuries were serious. She had broken bones and deep wounds. The nurses thought she might never make it, but slowly, with time and care, Zuwena's body began to heal. Her eyes opened. She couldn't remember much at first. Her speech was broken, and her memory was cloudy. She didn't know where she was or what had happened. But one thing she did remember was Bako's face, his voice, his laugh, and she held on to that, trying to gather strength to get back home. She didn't know the world had already moved on without her. Back in Nyamira, Bako was telling a very different story. He cried during the funeral, yes, but behind closed doors, things changed fast. Just a few weeks after Zuwena was declared dead, people started noticing him around town with a woman named Naledi. She was young, stylish, and always smiling at his side. They were seen holding hands at the market, sharing drinks at a local bar. Some people whispered about it, saying it was too soon, but others shrugged and said maybe this was Bako's way of healing. After all, he had lost his wife. But the truth was painful. While Zuwena lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, Bako was already laughing, joking, and falling in love again, or at least pretending to. Within 2 months of Zuwena's death, wedding plans were in motion, invitations were printed, a church was booked, clothes were tailored, and the couple posed for engagement photos. Bako smiled like a man who had left his past behind. In every picture, he looked confident, proud, and ready to start over. Nobody asked about the strange empty casket at Zuwena's funeral. Nobody asked why Bako seemed to heal so fast. And nobody knew that the woman he once promised to love forever was still breathing, still alive, and slowly starting to remember everything. Back in the rural clinic, Zuwena was finally learning to speak again. Her body was weak, but her mind was getting stronger. The nurses began to call her the silent fighter. One day, the farmer who had rescued her brought a radio to the clinic, and for the first time, Zuwena heard her name. A preacher on the radio was speaking about a miracle, a strange story about a woman who vanished after a crash. Zuwena felt chills. Memories rushed back. She remembered the road, the accident, Bako's face. She tried to sit up and speak. "My name is Zuwena," she whispered. After that day, she knew she had to get out. She told the nurses who she was and where she came from. Letters were sent. A kind doctor helped contact people in Nyamira. But even before official news arrived, Zuwena was already planning her return. She didn't want to warn anyone. She didn't want pity. She wanted the truth to hit hard, to hit Bako where it would hurt most, his pride. As the days ticked by, the wedding in Nyamira grew closer. Bako practiced his vows. Naledi tried on her dress. Guests were arriving from far and wide. No one had any idea that the real bride, the one they buried too soon, was walking her way back home, slowly, limping, but alive and ready to face everything. And so, while one woman was trying to survive, another was trying to take her place. While one heart beat weakly in a silent clinic, another beat loudly to the sound of wedding drum. Zuwena had been forgotten, erased, but she was coming back. And when she did, she wouldn't just return as a victim, she would return as a storm. The sun was shining bright over Nyamira that morning. Birds sang, flowers decorated the streets, and people filled the church with laughter and excitement. It was the day everyone had been waiting for, Bako's wedding day. After the painful loss of his wife, Zuwena, the town believed he had finally found happiness again. His new bride, Naledi, stood beside him, smiling and glowing in her white dress. People whispered about how beautiful she looked and how lucky Bako was to have found love again. He stood proudly at the altar, shaking hands, laughing loudly, and thanking guests for coming. He kept saying how life had been hard, but God's timing is perfect. What most people didn't notice, though, was the watch on his wrist. It wasn't just any watch. It was the same one Zuwena had given him on their 5th anniversary. A simple silver piece with their initials secretly carved inside. He wore it like it meant nothing. As he gave his speech, he even mentioned Zuwena. "I have suffered. I lost someone special. But sometimes, God takes away only to bless you with more." The crowd clapped and nodded. Some wiped tears. They believed him. They believed this was a new beginning. But outside the church, hidden from sight, stood a figure no one expected to see again. Zuwena, alive, dressed in a simple long scarf and a second-hand dress given to her by a kind nurse. She leaned slightly on a walking stick, her leg still healing from the accident. Her heart was racing, her eyes filled with tears and fire at the same time. She had come all this way from the rural hills, quietly, alone, without warning anyone. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment Bako would finally face the truth. Inside, the music played. The priest cleared his throat. "Let us begin," he said. Bako turned to Naledi, ready to say his vows. But just as he opened his mouth, the heavy wooden doors of the church slammed open. The sound echoed like thunder. Heads turned. A woman stepped in, slowly but firmly. The room went silent. Some people stood, others gasped. One of the photographers dropped his camera in shock. There she was, Zuwena, pale but standing tall, weak but full of strength. She walked step by step down the aisle, her limp noticeable, but her face calm. All eyes were on her. Children clung to their mothers. Elders crossed themselves. Someone whispered, "Is that a ghost?" Bako's mouth hung open. His face turned pale. The wedding ring slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. Naledi looked confused and angry. "Who is this woman?" she shouted. Zuwena didn't say much. She just raised her arm and showed the hospital bracelet still wrapped around her wrist. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Your bride called me dead," she said, "but I'm very much alive." Chaos broke out. People screamed. Some ran outside. Others froze. The priest looked like he might faint. A few guests pulled out their phones to record. It was the most shocking thing Nyamira had ever seen. The woman they had buried, the woman they cried for, was standing in front of them, alive and staring straight at the man who had tried to replace her. Bako tried to speak, but no words came out. He stepped back like he had seen a ghost. Naledi looked from him to Zuwena and back again, confused and furious. Zuwena walked right past her and stood in front of Bako. Then, without warning, she pulled out a brown envelope from her bag and handed it to him. "Court summons," she said. "See you soon." Then she slapped him. A loud, clean slap across the face. Gasps filled the church. Phones recorded everything. Zuwena turned and walked out of the church with her head held high. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply walked, slow, proud, and strong. She had come back from death, betrayal, and pain, and now she was walking away from a man who thought she would stay buried. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman. She was a storm that had returned to shake everything. And Nyamira would never forget what happened that day. Not ever. The church in Nyamira was full, packed from wall to wall with excited guests. The smell of fresh flowers filled the air. Soft music played, and everyone's eyes were on the front, where Bako stood in a smart suit beside his new bride, Naledi. The priest had just asked for quiet. The ceremony was beginning. Everyone waited for the vows. Phones were out. Cameras were recording. And the mood was joyful. People whispered to one another, smiling, ready to witness what they believed was a new beginning for a man who had suffered so much. Bako stood proudly, gripping the wedding ring tightly in his hand. Naledi smiled up at him, unaware of what was about to happen. The moment felt perfect, but just as the priest opened his Bible and began to speak, a loud sound cut through the church. The heavy doors at the back swung open with force. A sudden gust of wind rushed in, blowing petals off the pews. Everyone turned at once. And then came the silence, the kind that makes your heart stop. There, standing in the doorway, was a woman in a long white scarf. Her face looked pale, but her eyes were burning. Her dress was simple, not like a wedding gown, but she wore it with quiet power. She walked slowly, one step at a time, leaning slightly on a cane. Her legs still hadn't fully healed, but that didn't stop her. She moved forward like a ghost, returning to the world of the living. But this wasn't a ghost. It was Zuwena. Gasps echoed through the church. A woman screamed and dropped her purse. Some guests stood up. Others backed away in fear. The photographer, standing near the front, fainted on the spot. Phones dropped. Mouths opened wide. Bako stared in shock, frozen. His eyes were wide, his lips trembling. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The wedding ring in his hand slipped through his fingers and rolled onto the floor with a soft metallic clink. Naledi turned sharply, her smile gone. She looked at Zuwena, then at Bako, confused, angry, scared. "Who is this woman?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "What's going on?" Zuwena kept walking, never looking away from Bako. When she reached the middle of the aisle, she stopped. The whole room was still, waiting for her next move. She slowly raised her arm and showed everyone the torn hospital bracelet, still wrapped around her wrist. The name printed on it, Zuwena B. Otieno. Then she spoke, loud and clear. "Your bride called me dead," she said, "but I'm very much alive." You could hear a pin drop. Bako stepped back. His face turned grey. He looked like he might faint. Some guests rushed to leave the church, too shocked to stay. Others stayed frozen in their seats, phones shaking as they filmed. Zuwena stood there, tall and calm, the tears in her eyes refusing to fall. Naledi looked like she had been struck. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Then Zuwena walked straight up to Bako. No one dared stop her. She pulled out a folded brown envelope from her bag and pressed it against his chest. "These are court papers," she said. "You're going to answer for everything." And then she did something no one expected. She raised her hand and slapped Bako across the face. A loud, sharp slap. It echoed through the church, louder than the priest's microphone. Bako stumbled slightly, shocked, humiliated. People gasped. Someone yelled, "Record this!" Phones went up in every direction. The moment was captured from every angle. Zuwena didn't stay to see what would happen next. She turned around and walked out of the church the same way she came in. Slowly, with a limp, but proud, strong, alive. As she stepped out into the sunlight, people whispered, "She came back from the dead." Some even started calling her the ghost bride right then and there. Social media exploded within minutes. Photos and videos were posted online with captions like, "Bride returns from the grave" and "Wedding crash of the century." Hashtags like "Back from the dead," "Zuwena returns," and "Nyamira shock" trended instantly. The clip of her slap was shared over and over again. But Zuwena didn't care about the noise, the cameras, or the chaos. She had faced death. She had faced betrayal. And now she had faced the man who tried to bury her before she was even gone. She walked away not just as a woman who had survived, but as one who refused to stay silent. She didn't come back for pity. She came back for justice. And in front of the whole town, she made sure her voice was heard. By the time the sun went down that evening in Nyamira, the whole town was buzzing with only one name, Zuwena. Her return had shaken not just the church, not just her ex-husband, but the entire internet. People who had been guests at the wedding couldn't stop talking. Phones were out the minute she stepped into the church, and within minutes, photos and videos of her dramatic entrance were already online. By dinner time, hashtags like #ZombieBride, #Back from the Dead, and #Nyamira Miracle were trending across African social media. Everyone wanted to know who this brave woman was and how she had come back from the dead, walked into her husband's wedding, and left the whole town speechless. The most shared video wasn't even from a professional camera. It was shaky footage from a teenage guest who had his phone on the whole time. It captured the exact moment Zuwena walked down the church aisle, lifted her arm, and showed the torn hospital bracelet. People watched in shock as she looked straight at Bako and said, "Your bride called me dead, but I'm very much alive." And then came the moment that broke the internet, the slap, loud, clear, and full of meaning. Zuwena slapped Bako right in front of the priest, in front of his new bride, and in front of hundreds of guests. She handed him a court summons right after, and then walked out like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. That video alone hit 4.6 million views in just 48 hours. It was reposted on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and even news websites. Memes started popping up instantly. One showed Bako's shocked face with the caption, "When you try to marry but your first wife pulls up like a plot twist." Another showed Zuwena walking out of the church with the words, "Legends never die. They walk back in heels and hand you papers." Radio stations across Kenya, and even beyond, began talking about the Nyamira wedding crash. Morning shows debated it, and call-in programs were filled with people giving their opinions. Some people called Zuwena a hero. They said she was brave for showing up, for speaking her truth, and for not letting a man bury her while she was still breathing. Others were simply amazed by the story itself. How does a woman go missing in a crash, get declared dead, and then return just in time to stop her own husband from marrying someone else? It sounded like something out of a movie, but this was real life, and Zuwena was very real. Meanwhile, Bako became the target of heavy criticism. People called him a heartless man. Some questioned how he could plan another wedding just 2 months after Zuwena's death. Others blamed him for not even waiting to truly search for her body. And Naledi, the woman he tried to marry, was caught in the middle. Some felt sorry for her, while others joked online, calling her the backup bride or Mrs. Almost. Zuwena, however, stayed calm. She didn't go on TV. She didn't give interviews right away. She stayed quiet, letting the truth speak for itself. But one thing was clear, she wasn't hiding. She had walked into the fire and walked right back out without burning. That made her a symbol of strength to many women. Bloggers wrote about her, women's rights groups praised her, and young girls posted online saying, "I want to grow up and be like Zuwena." Within a few days, even international media picked up the story. Headlines read, Woman declared dead crashes husband's wedding in Kenya and the bride who came back to life. And as the views kept rising and the story spread across borders, Zuwena's name became bigger than just a scandal. It became a movement. Her return didn't just shake Bako, it shook a society where women are often expected to stay quiet, even when wronged. But Zuwena didn't stay quiet. She came back and showed the world what courage looks like, and the world couldn't stop watching. By the end of the week, Zuwena had gained over 300,000 followers on social media. People waited for her every post, every word, and when she finally broke her silence with one simple message, "I survived both death and betrayal. Now I live for truth," that post alone got over 1 million likes. This wasn't just a scandal anymore. It was a story of survival, of truth, of justice. Zuwena had set the internet on fire not by chasing attention, but by showing up when it mattered most. And long after the wedding flowers wilted and the guests forgot their outfits, one name still echoed everywhere. Zuwena, the woman who came back, not just to live, but to fight. After the chaos, after the headlines, and after the millions of views, Zuwena did something no one expected. She didn't hide. She didn't disappear in shame or fear. Instead, she stood tall and took back control of her life. She refused to let what happened define her. Instead of being remembered as just the woman who crashed a wedding, she chose to be remembered as the woman who rose again. Zuwena went back to school, determined to rebuild her life from the ground up. She wanted to help others who had suffered like she did. With quiet strength and powerful purpose, she opened a trauma center for women in Kizi, offering support, safety, and healing to those who had been through violence, loss, or betrayal. Her story inspired many, but Zuwena wasn't done. She sat down and wrote her journey, every painful truth and every brave step. The book she published was called "They Buried Me Too Soon." It quickly became a bestseller. People across the country, and even outside Kenya, read her words and felt her strength. She didn't hold back. She told the world what it was like to be forgotten, replaced, and left for dead. But more importantly, she showed how to rise. In interviews, when people asked her how she found the courage to come back after so much pain, Zuwena gave one powerful answer: "Some people survive accidents. I survived a husband." Those 7 words became a quote that people wrote on posters, shared online, and printed on t-shirts. Zuwena became more than just a name. She became a voice for women, a voice for survival, and a reminder that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who walk out of the fire, alive, scarred, but unbroken.